So welcome, delighted to have you here at Yale.
Really nice to be here. Thank you. I was going to tell a story that my advisor in graduate school used to tell frequently when I was a student. And it's about Phineas Gage, who was a railroad construction guy in the 1860s, early 1800s. And he was working on the railroad, and at a certain point, an accident happened, and he got a railroad tie through the roof of his mouth, and it went through the front of his brain. And they brought him into the hospital. They cut it off at the top. They didn't really know what to do with him. He healed up. They sent him home. And so much about him was the same. He could remember everything. He went back to work. He began to do things. Thank you. He, and for many extents and purposes, he was the same person. Yet it damaged the frontal lobe of his brain. And there was one thing, the frontal lobe is where we process emotion. And the one thing that he couldn't do was make a decision. Now, there's an irony in that, because when we try to inform our decision-making processes, frequently we defer judgment and defer the decision moment, saying, we need more information. We can't make that decision. And yet there's a cognitive link between where that moment fires in our brain that is the emotional part of the brain that actually lights up. And so this for me was a really, it was a profound element, and I'm sure it's an element in all of our work because we find ourselves very emotionally committed to many of the things that we do when we practice research. And yet, in order to function as a researcher and engage the analytical part of our brain, we need to shut that emotion off frequently. So then, how do we then re-engage the emotional parts and the communication ability, effectively the entire part of our brain system, in order to be able to effectively communicate to those people that need to effectively take in information, but also register it, find whether or not it's resonant with personal value, be able to engage the emotional part of the brain, and then make a decision. That's a very complex process, and it's something that we're learning an awful lot about recently. And so it's my great pleasure to present to you the TEEB for Me community, among other things, today, because it's been some of the places that we've been doing some of the more wild and unpredicted experimenting with the TEEB for Me effort. Where I come from is Southeast Alaska, about as far away from here in the United States as you can possibly get. And my reason for living there is because I left high school and I was taking care of my cousins when they were very young, and I became extremely attached to the landscape. The smells, the sights. Seasonality is incredibly intense in Southeast Alaska, and it allowed me to notice things that were changing in the ecological system around me. Now, that's something that happens with most people around the world, except for the fact that there's a disturbing trend, and that is that more and more people, and especially more and more children, are spending time indoors, and they're not getting that kind of exposure on a regular basis. Currently, the average American child spends 7.5 hours watching some form of media per day. They spend 1.5 hours texting per day. You want to know how much time they spend playing outdoors every day? Anyone want to guess? Average American child. Half hours. 10 minutes. 4 minutes. The average American child plays outdoors 4 minutes a day. Now, think about all the kinds of decisions that we're making right now. The generations that are making these decisions on behalf of the way in which we are managing our collective natural resources are all people that grew up effectively, many of them playing outdoors. So there's a disconnect between some major social changes that are occurring and the way in which we are emotionally connected to the landscapes, connected to each other, and also emotionally engaging with our information and decision-making processes. These are all very complex things that, when you think about it at broad scale, the mind tends to reel a little bit. Things get a little bit out of hand because you're joining right brain, left brain, rational, irrational, analytical, emotional. What do you do with that? So I'm going to tell you today about an approach that I've been using, that I've been finding really useful. One of the assigned readings today is a very short summary of a very powerful piece of writing by Donella Meadows that's very familiar to a lot of people, especially that are systems analysts. And so I'm going to introduce that as a toolkit, and then we're going to talk about how we explored it a bit through TEEB for me. This is just to make the point that increasingly wilderness and those places that are far out of reach are getting fewer and fewer. This is a map of travel time to major cities. Systems thinking enacts the idea of leverage. Did something bad happen? Well, if someone helps me with that, I'll just explain it. It's as if you're a child and you're on a playground and you're playing teeter-totter, and you're sitting on one end of the teeter-totter, and your great big brother sits on the other end of the teeter-totter, and you're stuck way up in the air, and you have no way of getting yourself down. What do? You get another friend to run up the other side of the teeter-totter and sit with you at the end of the teeter-totter to bring your side down so you can get the heck off. And so the point here is that you have greater leverage in certain parts of the system than others. And when we attack a very broad and complex system, we don't always act on the most powerful elements of the system. That is to say, if we can find elements, move ourselves a bit away from the fulcrum, that we can enact further leverage. And generally, we spend a lot of time in decision making establishing information about parameters, numbers, feedbacks, and so on. This is the data and the information piece. And our newspapers are replete with this kind of information. Relatively less information is talking to us about rules, but they're important ones. These are major legal innovations, that kind of thing. But very rarely do we get information about the kinds of things that are changing with mindsets, goals, and aspirations. Taking another look at this schema, lost a little bit of the formatting in the different computer system here, but that outer layer, we call this the onion model. The outer layer of the onion is where we have our parameters and numbers. Then at the next layer is the feedbacks and structure. Another deeper layer after that is the information flows and how they're governed. Another layer under that is the rules, then the goals, and at the deepest layer, the mindset of the system, how we are reflecting our basic values, whether or not we believe that a system can be changed. And this is really important because what if we are creating all of these rules and we're attempting to do something, say, combat climate change, but deep embedded in our mindset is the belief that we can't do anything. Fundamentally illustrating that it doesn't matter how much information you have about the system, or how much information is flowing around the system, or how many rules or laws or feedbacks you've created in order to correct the system. If at deep in the heart of the system you've got a problem with mindset, it means that much of the change that you're attempting to bring about will not happen. So that is to say, when we are working on strategic change with respect to all of the elements that are in the TEEB reports, it's important to focus on the structure and the layers of information so that not only are we informing the parameters and numbers, but that we're also thinking about how people are taking in information at progressively deeper layers of the system. In graduate school, I entered graduate school at the University of Maryland at the Institute for Ecological Economics. This is where the Costanza lab was based and where some of the first estimates for the value of natural capital came out. It was a very difficult time. And I say that not just because I was a tortured graduate student, but it was a difficult time because these estimates of the values of ecosystem services ran counter to a lot of the mindsets of the way people believe that value should be assigned. And putting a number on something or making something visible was very much like holding a lightning rod. And from a number of different perspectives, this was either unacceptable or began to not reflect the ways in which many people thought about systems. It was especially challenging because total economic value was generally assigned to those elements on the far left-hand side of the diagram. The direct use benefits, the tangible elements of ecosystems. And ecological services oftentimes were in the mid part of the diagram, where they were somewhat less tangible, they were less rival, they were less excludable, therefore they were less marketable. And then that didn't even begin to encompass all of these values on the far right-hand side, the most intangible values, those that were about option value, bequest value, or existence value. And so as a result, there was almost a perfect storm of factors being set up that we had a hard time dealing with because we hadn't accounted for all the diversity of ways in which people could have interpreted forms of value. So different types of value. There are those instrumental values. They might be anthropocentric, serving some kind of a human end use. They might be functional. So that is to say they contribute to the existence of another. Or they might be intrinsic. So that is to say that they might have value in their own right, and reference to any other entity isn't really required. And the TEEB reports begin to show how all of these values in a net whole are creating benefit, whether they're tangible or intangible, whether they are functional or instrumental, and so on. Another thing that we've been dealing with respect to making changes in the value of ecosystem services is laying out the goals ahead of us for where we do want to go, setting the mindset for the kinds of change that we want to create. Familiarity with this diagram? I would assume that many of you have encountered it in courses before. So this is to say this vertical axis is the ecological footprint and the horizontal axis is the Human Development Index. So if we want to consume at the level that the planet is providing ecosystem services on an annual basis every year, each person must consume at a per capita level below this line. If we want to meet human development goals, everyone needs to be to the right of this line, making this particular box particularly important. And there's only one country. This graphic was done, I believe, in 2005 by the Global Footprint Network. They make wonderful visuals for communication. Only one country in there. I know somebody in the audience knows who that is. No, not Switzerland. No, not Germany. Nope. Not Iceland. Not Costa Rica. Now think about how your answers are also reflective of your mindset of what it means to be successful or sustainable. Question some of those assumptions. To be to the right of the line, you have to provide lots of medical aid. You have to have low infant mortality. You have to have low petroleum fuel consumption. Cuba. Leading us to turn on our heads a lot of our assumptions about what our mindset is about success. So if this group of people that are incredibly educated and conscious of all these factors that are leading to sustainability have certain embedded assumptions about mindset of what it means to be successful, what does that mean for the broader population? And how can we take that and use that information to communicate more clearly? Proving the point, and Sally Collins, who was one of my mentors at the Forest Service, used to quote this a lot from Mark Fields at the Ford Motor Company. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. So our strategy is to try to become more sustainable, but our culture of making a lot of assumptions about what that success looks like really tends to derail the way in which we are approaching our problem strategy. Our problem set up here. So that leads to the importance of why we are or are not taking a systems-based approach. A system, just to define it, is a set of things, people, cells, molecules, or whatever that are all interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. So you ever play that game where you guys stand in a circle and you cross hands and then you have to figure out how to get yourselves out of that knot? Frequently you think, oh, well, maybe I should go over that guy, when in actual fact you have to go under. It takes a lot of time to sort out. But principally, another useful way of thinking about it is that problems frequently can't be resolved at the same level in which they're created. So the way to get yourself out of this knot game is to have someone from the outside looking in at a different scale and saying, well, everything's interconnected, but what if we did this and this? So again, just like the concentric layers of the onion, it helps to take a different scale or perspective in order to get a fresh look at the system and the way it's interconnected. So, principles of systems thinking. The art and science of making reliable inferences about behavior means that you have to understand increasingly deep layers of the system. Improvement in one area of the system can either positively or adversely affect another area of the system. There's many unintended consequences that happen in systems, and one way to diagnose those and to counteract them is to map them out. Another principle is small catalytic events can cause very large changes in complex systems. And I think that the actions that TEEB for me has taken in the past year to 2 years really shows a lot of this and has attempted to act upon this particular leverage point, and suggesting that we can strategically seed relationships among parts within a system and relating one system to another. And we can try to do that in a conscientious way to spread information about the value of ecosystems and the way in which we might preserve them over time. So I'm going to go through a couple of layers of the onion. I'm going to start with feedback loops. So a feedback loop is where you map out a system. You've got inputs and you've got outputs, and sometimes you've got an element on the left-hand side. Sometimes you've got an element of your output coming back and affecting your input. That leads to a lot of problems. And when a systems thinker or any kind of person that has a vision for the way things might be in the future takes a look at the future, there's a perceived gap between what the current level is and what the desired level is. And that you can take actions to affect change in order to close that gap over time. But what if you haven't mapped out a complete map of the system? What if someone were trying to fill up their glass, turning the faucet more and more, but what if there were a giant hole in the glass? This is exactly what's happening with ecosystem services right now. We are attempting to address ecosystem services by delivering more and more, or at least stemming the losses of ecosystem services. But it's very hard to communicate how demands for ecosystem services are effectively causing a bigger and bigger hole in the cup here. So in that sense, there's a certain extent to which we can turn our faucet to the right. But if we don't stem the demands for ecosystem services at the same time, we're not taking a full systems perspective. So this is a map of how payments for ecosystem services function. I know that all of you are familiar with those principles, so I'm not going to dwell on this. But again, inflow, state of the system, outflow. You have a perceived state, and you have your goal, and you have a discrepancy. You want to influence both the inflows and the outflows in order to take a systemic view of correcting the system. With ecosystem services, if we have a stock of natural capital, and we can say that there is a supply of ecosystem services, and in general there is regenerative capacity in that ecosystem over time. That is to say, nature tends to rejuvenate itself. And on the right-hand side, we've got ecosystem service demand that feeds human well-being. And we've got behavioral choices that modify this side of the system. The map here, the way payments for ecosystem services are currently addressing this, is by seeing a perceived scarcity, acting on investment, and having a payment for ecosystem service response to scarcity. The main goal there is to slow the loss of ecosystem services by investing in natural capital. What that doesn't do is address all the leakages to the system. That is to say, the increasing rate in which we are consuming ecosystem services. So that is to say that there's price and information that should be acting in order to govern ecosystem service uses. As things get more scarce, price generally should rise, but we know that that's not the case with ecosystem services. And the TEEB reports underscore that, mainly because many of the characteristics, the market-based characteristics for ecosystem services, neither reflect rival potential or excludable potential, and it doesn't account for the full suite of values that are being reflected. So that is to say that there's different ways of acting on the system in order to maintain stocks of natural capital in perpetuity over time. Next leverage point, information flows. I have been fascinated by the way in which information has spread. This is a map, I don't have it cited here yet, but it's a map of all of the connections amongst individuals on Facebook worldwide. And we can think about the ways in which there's flows of information that occur amongst different people in different countries, amongst different continents, north and south, and so on. There are many opportunities here for connecting information flows, either through social media or electronic means and so on, and we've been talking a lot about those. But how to strategically invest in those networks is an entirely different question. It's not just about Facebook, as all of you know. There's numbers of different kinds of networks. For example, each color here represents a different major or most popular social network in any given country. So China is using Qzone currently. Orkut is very popular in Brazil. High Five is another very popular network that was emerging in Asia. And so just because many people in the United States are interacting on a social network like Twitter or Facebook doesn't mean that the whole world is. However, many of our assumptions about who is being active on these networks is oftentimes not accurate. For example, the world's largest user of Twitter right now is Indonesia, and they're accessing those networks basically on mobile phones. This is a map of the percentage of 10 to 14-year-old girls who are falling 2 or more years behind grade for age. And the point I'm making here is that information can flow north to south, east to west, and to certain factions of society. And the way in which we invest in information flows allows access to certain factions, either gender, race, and other kinds of disparities. There's 2 particular pyramids. On the left, there are the demographics for developed countries, and on the right are the demographics for developing countries. And I put this graph in the presentation to underscore how important it is that we are seeding information amongst the most young cross-section of the developing world. Because investments, when we think about systems intervention over time as they develop, if we intervene at those age brackets down here, remember what I said about the amount of media use at this age. As these brackets get older, we're going to see a very different distribution amongst people of information. Engaging new and emerging information networks through social media is a very different task than it used to be. On the left is communications media goals, and on the right is social media goals. The difference is that on the left, the space is defined by the media owner, and on the right, the space is defined by the consumer, abruptly changing all of the ways and mindsets in the way all of these feedbacks and flows are functioning. This has a lot of implications for who is in control, be it the brand or the consumer. And currently, social media tools are less about blasting out information, but more about listening and conversation. It's less about the trendiest technology and more about meeting people where they happen to be and who they happen to be associating with. It's less about telling people what's good, and it's more about helping people pass on good information. It's less about getting the message out to the world and more about broadening and connecting and strengthening spheres of influence. So this is a screenshot of the Bank of Natural Capital website. Have you visited that? Show of hands. Yeah, great. So there's a different flow of information here. And I guess this was an experiment in getting information about natural capital out to the public at large. As you know, each one of the D reports, D0, 1, 2, 3, were all in paper reports. And D4 was TEEB for citizens. How many of you have ever written a paper and worked all-nighters and invested your heart into it and gotten it out? Your professor read it, you got it back, and there it sat on the shelf. How many of you have fears about that for perhaps your thesis? Everyone. I wonder that about my dissertation too. I wonder that a lot about the journal articles that I spend a heck of a lot of time writing. And one day, Rich Howarth, who you met on Tuesday, sent me a journal article to review for the Journal of Ecological Economics because it sounded like something I'd done my dissertation on. And I read the abstract, I said, sure, I'll review that. Gosh darn it, if someone hadn't plagiarized lock, stock, and barrel my entire abstract, the whole article, switched the names of the towns, and sent it into the Journal of Ecological Economics, and just happened to arrive on my desk for peer review. And I know that my job as a scientist, and I'm supposed to reproduce information, and I should keep plugging on that goal. But emotionally, I was devastated about this. And I thought, if I can spend all this time writing my dissertation and nobody uses that information, but it can also be plagiarized so easily, how am I supposed to make an impact in the world? And personally speaking, I was so disheartened that I thought there's got to be another way. Enter Twitter. Conscientious goals to put out information, and your objective there is to get as many people as possible to retweet and effectively plagiarize your every word with intention. So this seemed like a really fun direction to go after that particular thing. And it turned out that with scientific journal articles, I had to take about a year of reframing my approach to what was going to be most effective. But in the meantime, my investment in the social media world allowed me to continue to put out information, continue to look at systems analytically, and maybe take a different tactic delivering information. That over time, we're still trying to figure out how to report that in a structured sense, but for me, it's been a really rewarding experience. So TEEB for me, these are very old numbers. On Twitter, it's got probably about 5,000 followers right now. Folks are tweeting in about 19 different languages in 67 different countries. Obviously, none of the interns or anyone that's working on these tweets can translate that much, but again, growing the spheres of influence, it's possible to translate not only in language relevance, but also in application and make local ties in ways that TEEB, the TEEB core group, the TEEB affiliates directly could never do. And so there's a real power here in the future about who is getting information and how. And these users tend to be about 25 to 34 years old in the most active age groups. We would have liked to have had younger individuals, but it's difficult to attract those that are under 18. But we found a couple of different ways to engage them. We've done experiments with different ways in which we might frame information and get it out to the public. The beautiful thing about Twitter is that you can take the exact same piece of information and you can tweet it out in a positive way. You can be really excited, exclamation point, happy face. You can make a negative tweet. You can bemoan the loss of something. and you can present neutral information. And you can see how all of these things affect uptake of information and how much that is retweeted, passed forward. Obviously, much like Facebook, there's a reason why Facebook only has a like button. It's because psychologically speaking, people don't like to dislike things. And this is a really important message for communicating much of the issues about ecosystem services, because the story we continue to tell is a story about loss. And emotionally speaking, there are psychological barriers to taking in repeated amounts of information about loss. There are reasons why we wall that off. And as a result, if we're providing people information about loss, and they consequently are shutting down the emotional parts of their brain, they will not be able to engage those emotional parts of their brain in engaging a decision to take a change for the difference in the future. So, ironically, there's a fourth option: positive messaging, negative messaging, neutral messaging. The fourth one, and the most effective one, is giving people information about what their nearest neighbors are doing. And perhaps this is because it interacts at some level on some kind of evolutionary competition feature that we have in our wiring. People like to hear about what their neighbors are doing, what your classmates are doing in terms of carbon footprint, electricity use, so on and so forth. Japan waged a very effective campaign about reduction of electricity use, as did Juneau, Alaska, when an avalanche took out the hydro generators and everyone had to go on diesel, by giving people information about what their neighbors were doing. In Great Britain, in London, someone went along a street, gave everyone energy meters, and then went on the street and spray painted the amount of wattage that each household was using, making a very visible point about who's using what over time. These are very creative ways about giving people information that are very effective cognitively in stimulating change and forward-going action. But obviously there's different ways in which information might be popular or be relevant to the task at hand. One of the most popular posts on the TEEB for Me Facebook feed was a video of baby sloths. People love sloths, and for whatever reason, it was extremely popular, but it was a stretch for us to give it some contextual relevance. So there's a lot of work to be done in finding a mix of the really fun stuff. How many of you have seen the quick videos or the commercials or advertisements that we put out working in conjunction with MoFilm? The little things, yeah, a few of you. So they're available on the TEEB for Me website. Little things and also the Nature's Invoice. They're different ways of reaching people that combine heavy-hitting information with also alternative paths for the future in a way that's very entertaining. And this is a big frontier out there. So if any of you are interested in this as a career direction, I think that there's a lot of potential. Next layer of the onion is to talk about goals. I'm going to introduce this information here because it's a very effective way to talk with the public about that right-hand side of the feedback loop, the leak in the cup that I was talking about before. The TEEB reports talk about this concept in vague terms about living off the planet's interest. It's the idea that everyone has. You want to make enough money that you're living off the interest in your banking account. It's the way we define what it means to be independently economically wealthy at this point. If the planet has a certain stock of natural capital and has an annual flow of ecosystem services per year, as a global community, we must consume only this amount of ecosystem services or fewer as a global whole. If we consume more ecosystem services than that, we are eating into our stocks of natural capital. So this concept, how much of the ecosystem services we are using, has to do, on the right-hand side, the ecological footprint. That last image was from the Global Footprint Network. Again, geniuses with diagrams and communication. The right-hand side, consuming ecosystem services, and the left-hand side, the supply of ecosystem services, are not congruent. And so nature's interest minus humanity's footprint equals our ecological surplus or our ecological debt. This is a map that's been especially popular in many social media spheres. Again, Global Footprint Network, showing us in red ecological debt and in green ecological surplus by country. This is 1961, what it looked like. This is 2005. And imagine the trajectory where we're going in the future. So this is one way to get across this concept of ecosystem services and making the connection between a stock of natural capital and a flow of ecosystem services and the different things that we can do in order to shore up our ecological debt over time. The reason why I give this lead up is because this diagram was the result of a competition that TEEB for Me put out in conjunction with visualizing.org. So that is to say, all of the data from TEEB was available to different data visualization innovators, and a number of different case studies were put up. It was opened up to a crowdsourcing competition, and this was the winner. This is an interactive tool. It's linked to by the TEEB for Me website, and also by going into the visualizing.org website. You can also get to this page, and this is an interactive tool. So as you mouse over different countries, you can compare among two different countries on the left, and it will show you ecological footprint information. At the same time, it will also show you this dynamic between the ecological capacity, the ecological footprint, and the resulting deficit of every country that you mouse over. It's a fun little tool to play with, and also when you're comparing among different countries, it will generate reports comparing among ecosystem services, basically saying if everyone consumed like an average person in, say, Brazil or the United States, this is how many planets we would need in order to support those lifestyles. Another very effective communication tool has been the story of stuff. Obviously a cartoon-based way to describe the way in which we extract natural resources, fabricate them into products, bring them to manufacturing, consume them in the household, and then the output into our waste systems. And this is an element of the circular economy or the full cost accounting that might be done. And many of the different recommendations from different elements of TEEB talk about accounting for and making visible all of the ecosystem service impacts that are both supporting each part of this and effectively paying the price of many of these over time, or at least accounting for them in the decision-making processes. So effectively influencing how we consume, how we invest, how we produce, how we sell, but ultimately also how we plan for the use of ecosystem services over time. Another image, the ecological footprint of imports to the European Union from the top 20 trading partners. Again, we can show in a visual way where all of our ecosystem services are coming from. And it allows for a mindset shift about where our different ecosystem services need to be paid for in order to, or accounted for in order to preserve the system. This is an image from worldmapper.org, and it's a map. Each country is a different color, obviously. This is a map of net country timber imports. So it's imports minus exports. United States, obviously. On the right-hand side, there is Japan. We've got Australia down here. Indonesia is very small. Brazil and Africa, obviously, in red and green. And this is forest losses. So Indonesia has some of the most rich, but also some of the most fine layers of soil on the planet, and yet it is losing forest cover at some of the fastest rates in the world, leading to also fourth most populous country, Indonesia. Again, and ironically, this is also the country that is the most active in Twitter usage. There are networks of information, and there are trends and patterns that are forming. It's possible to suggest that there's a strategic intervention at hand here, but we have yet to exactly identify what that is and make progress toward it, which leads us to the next layer of the system. At the core of the system, we need to question many, many of our assumptions at a fundamental level, and we need to be able to pass and engage more kinds of information that allow people to effectively, over time, broaden their spheres of concern. This is Laura Barbier, Ed Barbier's daughter, in the Botanic Gardens in Great Britain with a QR code. Lots of familiarity with QR codes, I bet, amongst you. But effectively, people can snap pictures with their personal technology or telephones, take in information rapidly, digital information, and up will pop up a whole host of information. Now, imagine if it were possible to walk into, say, a lumber store, any of our major distributors, and you want to buy a desk. What if the product on the shelf had a QR code that when you snapped a picture of it, immediately brought you to a case study of all of the ecosystem service values and information and the places and people in which this particular production process impacted? It's a way of connecting the consumer to information about the product, but also acting on different layers of the cognitive connections that can then inform a consumer decision. One of the major problems we have with being able to invoke different choices in consumer decisions is that information just gets too complex for people. Or they might be doubtful about the reliability of the information that they're getting. Or they might not have it in the immediacy of the moment in which they're about to make that decision. It's possible to connect all of these dots if we strategically target it. And I'd suggest that it's possible to take a look at each one of your projects and think about, for the semester, not just about the different pieces of information that you might have at the more superficial layers of the system, but also ask yourselves, is it possible to get consecutively deeper into the system? And ask yourself, what is the predominant mindset about the problem that you have in front of you? And what tools do you have at hand, either real tools or potential tools or even imaginary tools, tools that you think the next generation might have in order to connect all of these different layers of information and propose an alternate future. Obviously, it's not, there's no panacea with serving up all of these different solutions. One of the big barriers is the digital divide, and this is a global download study of how fast people can download information worldwide, showing that on the order of 2,000 is really different than, say, 13. And so who has information and how quickly they are able to access it is a big barrier. But at the same time, we also need to note that there are currently 5.3 billion mobile subscribers in the world. Pavan has noted that he's an outlier because he has 3. But case in point, 3.8 billion mobile units are in the developing world. So when we think about the kind of technology, there is a digital divide, and many of the different efforts, say for example the $100 computer, was a noble effort to get information in the hands of those that most need it in order to make progress on our global development goals. But it's also possible to completely rethink the way in which we are communicating and delivering information and connecting these communities of influence in such a way that we can shift the mindset in a coordinated fashion and bring about an alternate solution. So 3 big concepts for the future that currently remain a challenge. Obviously, many of you are familiar with this diagram from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment describing the ways in which we characterize all of the different kinds of ecosystem services, supporting, provisioning, regulating, cultural on the left, and then all the ways in which we benefit on the right. But one of the main contributions of the TEEB report is showing how value exists in all of these different quadrants. On the upper axis is whether or not a good or service is excludable. If, for example, I can charge to access a scenic viewpoint. If I've made somebody pay $5 to get through the gate, can I exclude everyone that hasn't paid that amount? Rival. If one person consumes a good or service, is someone else able to consume the other good or the same amount of good or service, or does it diminish over time? For example, if I eat a piece of pizza, there's not a piece of pizza left over for Pavan to eat. So therefore, it gives me extra incentive to pay money for eating that piece of pizza. Most ecosystem services currently lie in this lower right-hand corner. This is an old paper by Randall. It's very fundamental to categorizing and explaining why ecosystem services in the market sphere are very visible. Markets can account for them. We can witness transaction cost and transactions occurring with them. GDP is especially impacted in that blue quadrant. However, most ecosystem services on a planetary level are provided in the public, they're pure public goods. So as a result, if we don't account for value in a visible way in each one of these sectors, we are unable to make effective provisioning and shore up our institutions in such a way that we're actually able to provide them efficiently and in perpetuity. Second concept, overshoot. I think it was just yesterday that I received an email from the Global Footprint Network saying it's the overdraft notice, saying if we consumed worldwide all of the available ecosystem services over the year, at a certain point where, along the year, humanity is going into overdraft. And that day is coming earlier and earlier every year. This is a concept which, if yes. Yes. 1987, 1990, 95, 2000, 2005, and then the most recent one is 2008. So it doesn't account for the current date. Which leads us to the final point. And this is particularly important for our agencies when we are thinking about how we make decisions. Because as Pavan just mentioned at the beginning, and as Rich covered, talking about the discount rate, $1 in the present day is not either cognitively or realistically the same as $1 in the future. However, our natural capital is just as relevant, if not more, to the population today as it will be in the future. So as a result, we need to be treating our decision processes on different time frames. And frequently, public agencies have things like annual budgets. You get your allocation from Congress, you have 1 year to spend it. If you don't spend it within that calendar year, you probably lose it. If you spend it in such a way that it saves things like energy, or say you pay money for recycling, frequently money goes back to the Treasury as a whole, and we don't have those feedback systems that are bringing incentive back to those decision makers so that they can keep the savings for themselves. Thus, they're making the best decisions for individual units, But with respect to the entire system, over time, we're seeing the same processes of overdraft occurring. So what that means is we need to be correcting feedback loops in who is getting the incentive and when they're getting it. We also need to think about time horizons. Imagine, for example, if you're going to decide, should I rent an apartment this year or should I take the leap and buy a house this year? The first year you make that decision, you are down in the red. And if everyone were making all of their decisions, and this is currently how we're making our decisions about natural capital, we don't want to make the decision to buy that house, invest in that infrastructure, or build up our stocks, because in the immediate term and emotionally, we are seeing that as being in the red, without the ability to see the long term and the systemic perspective, and also emotionally and cognitively calculate and anticipate that break-even date, right where the gray turns to red here, to pink. And from that point, especially we aren't able to calculate the payoffs, especially for future generations, talking about what does the shape of this curve look like? Do we get just a little boost, or is it actually exponential once we start breaking even? Oftentimes with natural capital investments, we find that small amounts of investment very early on in the system lead to very large profit margins in many senses in the long run. So I know that taking on all of this, especially the emotional, psychological, systemic, and mindset layers to your projects are especially difficult. And without taking a strategic and concerted approach to each one of those layers of the system, we risk losing some of the most important drivers and elements at the very core. So start where you are, do what you can, and use the gifts you have. Thank you.